So Jonathan Westaway is Senior Research Fellow at the University of Central Lancashire. He is a cultural environmental historian. He works on imperial cultures of exploration in the polar regions and in mountain environments, and also in arid environments to some extent. He's published on mountaineering and travel in the Himalayas and in Central Asia. His interest in these themes go beyond the academic. He has curated an exhibition on called Kanchenjunga 1929, using photographs from a German expedition. And he's also published on a rather different topic on the Orkneys and their Arctic connections in a very interesting paper in Atlantic Studies. But he's talking about Everest today. And one of the reasons he's talking about Everest is that he, with Paul Gilchrist at Brighton, are leading an AHRC network. This is a new networking project, which is entitled Other Everests, Commemoration, Memory and Meaning, and the British Everest Expedition Centenaries, 2021 to 24. And what that project is doing, he might say a little bit about it, but I'll just introduce it. It is reflecting on the heritage of these expeditions a century ago, and in particular, what they mean today and what can be done with them. And there will be a website coming and social media. Look out for hashtag Other Everests, and you will find it in a short period of time. And that project will be going on for, I think, 3 years or 2 years at least, several years, we shall say. So today, Jonathan is talking about Everest, and the title I've got here, and again, the ritual of announcing the title and seeing if it's the same will now apply. It is called Bodies of Ice, Post-Mortal Immobilities, and Mount Everest as a Mortuary Landscape. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Felix. I shall just share my screen, colleagues, bear with me. Can everybody see the slides? Is that okay? Yeah,
it's fine.
Yeah, I shall proceed. Okay, thank you for that introduction, Felix. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. As Peter Hansen has reminded us, mountaineering and modernity emerged together, the summit position coming to symbolize the Enlightenment in European culture. Entangled in multiple discourses, the search for ascendancy and the transcendent in high risk and extreme environments inevitably brought mountaineers face to face with death and the particular transformations mountaineering accidents performed on the human body. Bodies transfigured by acute trauma sustained by falling, stonefall and avalanche, and bodies slowly transformed by biotic and abiotic processes, and bodies seemingly arrested indefinitely within the cryosphere. All of this a dark counterpoint to Enlightenment discourses of rationality and perfectibility. So my research has used historical methods to investigate the mountaineering encounter with death and its unique necrogeographies. In 2013, I published a paper that focused on the Lake District and placemaking and commemoration associated with the Great War, particularly around the donation of mountain summits, the mountain summits of Great Gable and Scafell Pike, to the National Trust as war memorials between 1919 and 1923, showing how mountaineering deaths and deaths in the Great War became linked in the creation of sacralized landscapes. And this led me to think about the wider mountaineering encounter with post-mortal human remains and the highly unusual subcultural practices they often entail, encounters that are being accelerated by climate change and the extension of leisure cultures into more and more extreme environments at altitude. And I was very lucky to take part in the ESRC Encountering Corpses network, which was led by Professor Craig Young at MMU, which helped shape some of my thinking in this area. So this paper looks at Everest and its unique necrogeographies via the human encounter with corpses on the mountain, drawing attention to aspects of what we might term the spatio-temporal uncanny that adhere to human remains within the mountain cryosphere. So my work is mainly historical and to some degree theoretical. I'm particularly interested in ethical approaches to human remains in these environments. I think it's fair to say there is a deficit in terms of ethnographic fieldwork in this area. We're very lucky though. Jace Wilson at Leeds Beckett University is just about to complete a PhD, which has involved ethnographic fieldwork on 8,000 meter peaks with guides, with clients, talking to them about their attitudes to risk and death. You know, this work is going to fill a real gap, I feel. So very much looking forward to seeing publications coming from that PhD. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is I'd like to start by introducing a kind of analytical framework that will help us understand these complex necrogeographies on Everest. I want to provide a very brief history of mountaineering attitudes to death and the mountaineer's encounter with corpses, and then go on to outline the spatio-temporal disruption to this disposal of human bodies at altitude and within the wider cryosphere, noting in particular some of the uncanny aspects of post-mortal mobility of human remains. And fundamentally, you know, we have to understand the limits to human agency that altitude imposes, that creates fundamental disruptions to cultural approaches to dead bodies. And then we also need to situate this in the context of the accelerated release of human remains within the cryosphere due to climate change. Okay, if we just take some time, I want to introduce some theoretical approaches that may help us think about these issues. The philosopher Michael Marder, in a paper in Environment, Space and Place, entitled On the Mountains, or the Aristocracies of Space, has described mountain summits as a state of exception where neither political law nor the habitus of everyday life apply. And I think one of the most interesting features of you know, these extremes of altitude is the limitations they place on human agency, and by association, limitations placed on state agency as well. So I've been thinking about these spaces. I've been thinking in the context of James Scott's work, his Zomia thesis about Highland Asia as a non-state space. I'm wondering whether we can theorize Everest as a non-state space colonized by globalized leisure cultures. Altitude places physical limitations on the human ability to work, to do anything, leading to ethical challenges and seemingly transgressive behaviors. And it also disrupts normative human approaches to recovering, identifying and disposing of human remains. I've been very interested in bodies which have become fixed on the mountain. So human remains at altitude enter, I would argue, new spatio-temporal regimes and new ontic states, new states of being. Bodies are permanently preserved with biotic and abiotic processes of decay arrested. Bodies become features in the landscape, fused to the mountain cryosphere. So I've used the phrase mortuary landscape to describe this place. It's with aspects of liminality. And we'll look at this in a bit more detail. I think it raises really important questions about post-mortal personhood when human remains become landscape features, become landmarks. If we'd been talking about Everest 20 years ago, this would have been, you know, quite a fixed environment, but of course, accelerating climate change on Everest means that human remains are being released from the cryosphere quite rapidly at the moment. So in a recent article in Climate and Atmospheric Science, draws our attention to the fact that the South Col is losing ice roughly at 80 times faster than it took for the ice to accumulate on the glacier's surface. 2,000 years of ice accumulation has disappeared since the 1990s. And what this means is that informally disposed of human remains are increasingly being encountered as part of waste removal efforts on the mountain, causing problems for the authorities. in terms of identification, repatriation, things like this. This accelerated change within the cryosphere is having some interesting kind of temporal manifestations, I think. Post-mortal human mobility has always been a feature of glaciers. You know, bodies move within glaciers. Aspects of the spatio-temporal uncanny, I think, are now being experienced throughout the deteriorating cryosphere. So I'm really interested in this notion of slippage in time. Pierre Nora, when writing about Lieu de Mémoire, highlighted that the acceleration of history was really diagnostic of modernity. And he described it as an increasingly rapid slippage of the present in a historical past that is gone for good. I suppose what these bodies suggest to me is what if the past is not gone for good? Does the revenant-like return of recent human remains exposed by melting ice suggest an increasingly rapid slippage of the recent past into the historical present? And how are we to deal with the social acceleration of encounters with corpses within the changing cryosphere? I think it's fair to say there's very little research in this area, certainly very little that I've come across. Another analytical frame in terms of thinking about Everest is that of border zones. Everest sits astride an international border. To the south, we have Nepal, which is high on the fragile state index. It's beset by political instability, corruption. It suffered from, terrible natural disasters recently, and governance is very, very weak. To the north, we have Chinese-occupied Tibet, with a state that is territorially maximalist and exerts its control over the border region and frequently closes access to the mountain from the north down when it feels that there's been infringements of its rights as a state. So I've been thinking about Everest as a boundary object, defined as an object that is part of multiple social worlds and facilitates communication between them, which has a different identity in each social world that it inhabits. And as a result, a boundary object must be simultaneously concrete and abstract, simultaneously fluid and well-defined. I've also been thinking about these bodies on the mountain, been thinking about the work of various geographers like Stuart Eldon, thinking about volume and how height and depth instead of surfaces in 3 dimensions, instead of areas, changes how we think about the politics of space. Another theoretical analytical kind of framework I've been thinking through is, geographical work on necrogeographies, defined as the role of place in human mortality and the spatial agency of the dead. And I've been particularly engaging with Akili Mbembe's work on necropolitics, his extension of the biopolitical, and wondering whether we can extend the notion of necropower beyond the state's power to kill and the right to expose others to death, to include the power to deny personhood to human remains. Recently as well, I've been thinking about what Dan Hicks, in a recent work on colonial collections and imperial violence, in his book, The Brutish Museum, has termed necrography, writing about loss, writing about how death and loss are integral to imperial legacies. And he says this necrography has begun to excavate the circumstances of some of this loss. Excavation must always begin with the most recent layer, and archaeology is not the study of fragments of the past, but the science of human duration. And that got me thinking about ice and the cryosphere as an archive in which human remains remain, and we are forced to encounter them in various ways. And finally, in terms of analytical frames that we might approach these ideas, I've been thinking about how we can fit the history of Everest into wider cryohistories. I've been reading Isabel Gapp's recent review essay on some of the theoretical work around cryoscapes and cryohistories. And of course, we've got new works coming out soon by Klaus Dodds and Sverker Sorlin on ice humanities, living and thinking and working in a melting world. So how does Everest and all these analytical frames that I've just described fit in within wider cryohistories that we're trying to write at the moment? Okay. What I'd like to do now is just give you a really brief sketch of the mountaineering kind of encounter with death and human remains. I think it's important to understand that as mountaineering emerged in the Alps in the 19th century as a middle-class leisure pursuit, death rates were very high due to the primitive nature of techniques and protection equipment. Mountaineering deaths created a problem of representation for mountaineering literature and photography, and for the historian, a problem of sources. Religious, romantic, and scientific approaches to corpses all struggled to address the horror of disfigurement and trauma evident in mountaineering accidents. Most published accounts of encounters with corpses of mountaineers avoid detail. W.M. Crook, describing the search for and recovery of the body of the mountaineer O.G. Jones after an accident on the Dent Blanche in 1899, wrote, "I will draw a veil over what we found. Men cannot fall many thousands of feet and lie in artistic attitudes." Mountaineering accidents necessitated changes to widespread cultural approaches to corpses in the Victorian and Edwardian eras. In the 19th century, bodies recovered from alpine mountaineering accidents often required prompt interment in the hot summer months of July and August, leading to a tradition of mountaineers being buried where they fell rather than bodies being repatriated. Similarly, the trauma sustained by the corpse deterred the Victorian practice of funerary photography as memento mori. As Audrey Linkman argues, Victorian post-mortem photographic portraiture served as a form of consolation for those unable to observe the Victorian custom of visiting the corpse and paying their last respects in person, with photographers attempting to ameliorate or suppress evidence of physical deterioration. The trauma sustained in most mountaineering accidents rendered the photographic commemoration of the good death impossible. There are almost no post-mortem photographs of mountaineers from before the 20th century. This rather tender and haunting portrait of Alexis Pache is one of the earliest I've found and was taken by Jules-Jacques Guillemot in 1905, prior to Pache's burial at the foot of Kanchenjunga. And whilst his family may have received a copy of this photograph, it remained hidden in the archives until a biography was published of Jacques Guillemot in 2012. As the death toll mounted, knowledge of mountaineering accidents circulated and informed attempts to regulate or ban mountaineering in the 19th century. One particular British concern was that the haute bourgeoisie's mania for alpine mountaineering meant that the higher professions were bearing the brunt of the casualties. I'll just give you one example. Professor John Hopkinson, from an established Manchester industrial family, was the foremost electrical engineer of his day and head of the Siemens laboratories at King's College London. And he died in a mountaineering accident in the Swiss Valley in August 1892. So this photograph of his funeral from the Hopkinson papers held at the Institute of Engineering Technology in London is the only photograph I have ever found of a mountaineer's funeral. It feels transgressive, the camera is placed well back from the ceremony, but you can clearly see that there is more than one body. And it was this accident, perhaps more than any other in the late 19th century, that shocked the British public, because Hopkinson died roped together along with his 3 young children on a relatively easy route. As mountaineering moved into the greater ranges, recovery and burial of bodies became increasingly impossible. Altitude imposes restrictions on human agency. So, for example, in 1976, the American climber Nanda Devi Unsold died after 5 days stormbound above 24,000 feet on Nanda Devi, unaware of the frantic efforts of her father, her fiancé, and other climbers to save her. The distraught climbers discussed the possibility of carrying the body back down the mountain, but this was never even a remote possibility. They did not want to leave her in the tent to be found by the next expedition up the ridge. So they did the only thing they could do, and after an improvised committal service, dropped her body down the 10,000-foot northeast face of Nanda Devi into the glacial basin of the Nanda Devi Sanctuary. Glaciers, of course, transport bodies far from the site of death to emerge revenant-like many years later, adding to the unheimlich knowledge that beneath the ice, the dead are still moving to their final destination. The first accurate prediction of when the body of a dead mountaineer would emerge from the snout of a glacier was made in the 19th century. Glaciers also produce uncanny transformations on bodies. The glaciologist and mountaineer James Forbes described in his travels through the Alps of Savoy in 1843 his discovery on a mountain pass of the corpses of 3 men in various stages of decomposition. The freshest was on a slope of scree and lay face down, its hand still in its pockets. It was so well preserved that Forbes thought it must have been a recent casualty until he turned it over and saw how its face had been rubbed off, and that the thaw had carried it downhill. The second comprised of a little pile of bones surrounding a backpack. The third was the strangest of them all. It lay on a glacier and its flesh had long since vanished. Its skeleton, however, was still intact and was strung out in an extraordinary and yet anatomically correct fashion. From head to foot, it measured 5 yards. So the glacier had stretched the skeletal remains. Climate change has seen a rapid acceleration in the emergence of the bodies of climbers from expanding ablation zones in snowfields and glaciers. This post-mortal mobility is an increasing feature of our unstable cryosphere. As the anthropologist Julie Cruikshank notes in her book, Do Glaciers Listen?, her ethnographic study of indigenous and settler encounters with glaciers in the Pacific Northwest, glaciers exhibit a temporal and spatial strangeness that underpinned indigenous belief in glacial agency. A belief that glaciers were in dialogue with humans, listening, judging, and responding to human behavior. Cruikshank noted that indigenous oral traditions frame glaciers as intensely social spaces where human behavior, especially causal hubris and arrogance, can trigger dramatic and unpleasant consequences in the physical world. So the accelerating emergence of what we might term the difficult dead whose return in some form from glacial ice due to climate change, reinforces this sense of glaciers as agentic landscapes. In his book, Hyperobjects, Philosophy and Ecology at the End of the World, the environmental philosopher Timothy Morton describes climate change as a hyperobject, a class of objects massively distributed in time and space relative to humans, characterized by the uncanny scalar problems of its non-locality. Largely invisible to humans, we experience its local manifestations as perturbations characterized by what Morton terms viscosity. The more you try and get rid of them, the more you realize you can't get rid of them. We can perhaps then see these bodies as a metaphor for the Anthropocene, signaling to us that there is no elsewhere that conveniently disposes of our dead, collapsing nature-culture binaries and demonstrating our situatedness in the environment. Rapid glacial retreat in the Alps has led to the recent reemergence of significant numbers of bodies from glaciers. Just want to give one example here. So Marcelin and Francine Dumoulin disappeared on August the 15th, 1942 on the Saint Florent Glacier in Switzerland at an altitude of 2,600 meters. They left behind 7 orphan children who were all adopted by different families. And their bodies were eventually discovered by a ski piste worker on the 13th of July, 2017. The Dumoulins' 80-year-old daughter said, and I quote, that I couldn't put it behind me, and I kept returning to the glacier, and now my parents have returned to me. So she talked about being at peace and being able to give them a Catholic funeral, but note carefully what she says. She said, my parents have returned to me. Philosophers, archaeologists, and jurists have long argued over the personhood of the dead and the moral obligation it entails to them. Madame Dumoulin's ability to continue a place-specific relationship with the bodies of her parents, their emotional and effective impact on her underscores the relational basis of personhood. The ability of these bodies to move in time and space also suggests their ongoing agency, a key component of personhood. Just another quick example. In 2013, a helicopter pilot spotted the remains of the British mountaineer Jonathan Conville, who had disappeared in 1978 below the Matterhorn. Conville's sister, Katrina, traveled to a Swiss pathology lab to be reunited with her brother's partial remains. And she said it was so poignant. There was a mummified hand with nails and skin and cut like it was waiting to be held. It was 34 years on, and I was holding my brother's hand. It was bittersweet, but it was so wonderful. Oops. So because of climate change, there's an increasing amount of academic research and institutions focused on the emerging field of glacial archaeology. And just to give a few examples, Johann Reinhardt's work in the late 1990s on the children of Yuyayaco, these Andean mummies found on the Chilean-Argentinian border, perfectly preserved up to 22,000 feet, extending our notion of the upper limit of deliberate human interment, has been an absolute revelation and has led to the founding of the Museum of High Altitude Archaeology in Argentina. In North America and in Norway, we've got the development of ice patch archaeology, where it's in effect rescue archaeology as these remnant ice patches increasingly are disappearing, and there's some extraordinary finds coming out of this work. This kind of approach is now being applied in the UK, and I draw your attention to Graham Warren and his colleagues' work at University College Dublin, applying this to post-glacial landscape in the Cairngorms in the UK. And in Italy, we've got the Institute for Mummy Studies in Bolzano because of Ötzi the Iceman, and a lot of their expertise has also been applied in identifying recent human remains from World War I and conflict zones, glacial sites in the Dolomites. So it's these levels of preservation and mummification at altitude due to low temperatures and aridity that enabled the Mallory and Irvine research expedition to eventually locate the body of George Lee Mallory on the northern slope of Everest in 1999. Determined to disturb the body only once, the team hacked the body out from the frozen talus, recovered identifying items from the body, and undertook an archaeological and photographic survey. One team member recalled, he said, there was an intense feeling of reverence. At one point, I thought about how proud I was of my partners. We were walking a very fine line, trying to do a responsible job archaeologically, while still treating the body itself with the dignity it deserved. This was one of our great heroes, after all. With the full permission of Mallory's family, the climbers collected DNA samples, reburied the body under stones, and performed a Church of England committal service. I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of bodies on Everest are not accorded the same levels of respect. Current estimates suggest that there are 200 plus unrecovered bodies on Everest. The boom in adventure tourism from the 1990s has seen Everest increasingly characterized by the troubling geographies of death. The practical problems of recovering and removing dead bodies from an 8,000 meter peak has led to significant accumulations of bodies, their removal often only being addressed alongside wider environmental concerns by expeditions like the 2010 Everest cleanup expedition. Since 2008, on the south side of Everest, there have been informal attempts to recover bodies. Companies like Asia Trekking have gone up and cleaned up the mountain, and at the same time they will recover human remains. And increasingly now the Ministry of Tourism is sending expeditions up the mountain every year to recover garbage. And when they do that, they always bring back human remains, which are melting out of the mountain. On Everest, the location of death, approach to corpses and funerary rites remains spatially stratified and segregated along ethno-religious and cultural lines. On the south side of Everest, on the Nepalese side, most indigenous high-altitude labourers die in the Khumbu icefall. And they also experienced the highest death rate. This graphic was produced by the BBC in 2015, showing that most Western clients die higher at altitude, usually above 8,000 meters. Most indigenous high altitude laborers die lower down in the Khumbu icefall. And just another graphic to show that the vast majority of deaths are still by Nepalese high altitude laborers. The Sherpas come from close-knit communities in the Solu Khumbu in Nepal, often climbing with relatives or fellow villagers. And even if Sherpa bodies have not been recovered or have been lowered into crevasses since the Second World War, according to Sherry Ortner, it's been very common for relatives of deceased Sherpas to come up and participate, often very emotionally, in abbreviated versions of traditional Sherpa funeral rites at or near base camp. So the Sherpa position towards human remains, according to Dawa Stephen Sherpa, who's the managing director of Asia Trekking, is that if it's at all possible, human remains should get a burial. That's not always possible, he says, if a body is frozen to a slope at 8,000 meters, but we can at least cover it and give it some dignity so that people don't take pictures. Sherry Ortner, in her magnificent ethnography of Sherpa mountaineering, Life and Death on Mount Everest, provides ample evidence of Sherpas giving up climbing after the death of neighbours and relatives. And modern Sherpa identities are increasingly at odds with Western commercial attitudes to death on the mountain. On the 18th of April 2014, 16 Sherpas died in an avalanche in the Khumbu icefall. In what followed, an increasingly militant body of young Sherpas closed the mountain down, refusing to work for the rest of the 2014 season, in part as a protest at the quasi-colonial work conditions they encountered, where profits flow offshore and risk is borne by Nepalese employees, in part a demonstration of the collective need to perform funeral rites and communicate with the bereaved, and in part a need to spiritually cleanse the mountain. Death on Everest is also kind of differentiated on either side of the border. Most Western commercial clients ascending the North Ridge, the Northeast Ridge, the Tibetan side, are far better prepared, as the Chinese authorities only allow mountaineers on the mountain who have summited a previous 8,000 meter peak. So there's a far higher degree of regulation on the north side of the mountain. The objective dangers of being caught high on the Northeast Ridge meant that This route traditionally was the most dangerous and saw the most fatalities amongst Western clients. But with better forecasting and greater regulation in Tibet, that's changing. And we're increasingly seeing more overcrowding on the South Col route on the Nepalese side. Those ascending from the Nepalese side mostly die above Camp 4, which is situated on the South Col at 8,000 meters. And they die generally descending from the summit. Death zone rhetoric indulged in by adventure travel contractors, their clients and the press obscures the fact that Everest is a mortuary space where bodies have become features in the landscape. To avoid this, human remains are usually committed to the mountain, an interesting phrase. That is, they are respectfully pushed into a crevasse or off a steep slope out of sight. And when it's possible, they might be covered with rocks, forming an improvised burial mound. But as one mountain guide who'd reached Everest summit 15 times has emphasized, the time to move the body is when the accident happens. And he said, not to get too grotesque, but the bodies become attached to the hill. One such body on Everest's North Ridge was known for 20 years simply as Green Boots. Thanks to investigative journalism by Rachel Newer of the BBC, we know that the body is that of Sewang Paljor, a young Ladakhi in the Indo-Tibetan border police who was caught out in the terrible storms of 1996, made famous in John Krakauer's book, Into Thin Air. But for Newer's journalism, Sewang Paljor would have remained nameless, a waymark to and from the summit, his image shared on the internet. So prominent was Sewang's body that when snow cover is light, climbers have to step over his legs on their way to and from the summit. The British climber David Sharp also died in what became known as Green Boots Cave in 2006. His parents requested for his body to be moved out of sight the following year, but left on the mountain. Repatriation insurance is, of course, hugely expensive and requires risking the lives of 6 to 8 Sherpas to recover the body. Ang Sering Sherpa, president of the Nepal Mountaineering Association, summarized the problem. He said a dead body that normally weighs 80 kilograms might weigh 150 kilograms when frozen and dug out with the surrounding ice attached. In 2007, the British mountaineer Ian Woodall mounted an expedition to find and rebury the body of Francis Di Stefano Artsentiev. Artsentiev had died in 1998 in her attempt to become the first US woman to summit Everest without supplementary oxygen. Her body had subsequently become known as Sleeping Beauty, with pictures circulating on the internet, causing enormous distress to her family. It took Woodall and Puri Sherpa 5 hours to dig Frances out and lower her off the mountain, not recover her body, but simply move it out of the way. In terms of physical effort, Woodall said it was the hardest thing that I've ever done, much harder than going to the summit of Everest. The determination to recover bodies from Everest can be differentiated along ethno-religious lines as well. Ever since Nehru founded the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute in Darjeeling in 1954, mountaineering in India has been a nation-building project. Ethno-religious nationalism in India is increasingly focusing on summiting Everest, and this has been accelerated by Hindutva policies of the BJP nationally, and in West Bengal in particular. West Bengal has a huge number of patriotic mountaineering clubs, and many poor Bengalis have been drawn into attempting Everest, often with inadequate funding and equipment. The Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist John Branch has recorded the death of one such Bengali mountaineer, Gautam Ghosh, on the 21st of May, 2016. Branch said Ghosh was a 50-year-old police officer from Kolkata, part of a doomed 8-person expedition. 4 climbers from the Indian state of West Bengal and 4 Sherpa guides from Nepal. that ran out of time and oxygen near the top of Everest. The 4 Bengali climbers were eventually abandoned by their guides and left to die. 3 did. Only one, a 42-year-old woman named Sunita Hazra, survived, as did the guides. So the intense pressure from families and local politicians forced the West Bengal state government to provide $90,000 to pay 6 Sherpas from the Company 7 summits to recover the bodies of the 3 mountaineers. And I would encourage you, if you get a chance, to go and have a look at this article. There's some video footage in there as well of the recovery of the bodies. It's an extraordinary piece of journalism. We also need to recognize that Everest is situated on a major international border, and this affects the biopolitics of recovering human remains at altitude. The Nepalese state is characterized by weak centralized institutions, corruption, and political instability, exacerbated by widespread poverty and the debilitating effects of natural disasters like the 2015 earthquake. And weak governance means that adventure travel companies are very poorly regulated. So the 2019 pre-monsoon Everest climbing season hit headlines all around the world. Everest has long been the focus of globalized over-tourism and overconsumption of the commons, but significant overcrowding on the mountain in 2019 led to what some termed blue skies deaths. Despite the good weather, individuals became trapped in the death zone by overcrowding on routes, spending too long at altitude, and were unable to descend. 11 commercial clients died in the space of 16 days, most of them whilst descending from the summit. Shocking accounts appeared on social media and in the press of overcrowding on the South Col route, as under-resourced commercial outfitters and commercial clients with little or no mountaineering experience created this traffic jam at altitude. And one commentator and adventure filmmaker described what he saw on his summit push on the 23rd of May, 2019. He said, "I cannot believe what I saw up there. Death, carnage, chaos, lineups, dead bodies on the route, and intense at Camp 4. People who I tried to turn back who ended up dying. People being dragged down, walking over bodies. Everything you read in sensational headlines all played out on our summit night." So sensationalist accounts produced during the short pre-monsoon season provoked response and reflection from the mountaineering community on the causes of these problems on Everest. And whilst the debate has tended to focus on the prevention of injury and death on the mountain via improved governance and regulation, there has been little discussion of how to manage the problem of human remains on Everest. Expeditions on Everest are governed by the UIAA Kathmandu Declaration and Code of Practice for Expeditions. But these governance documents make absolutely no mention of human remains and how they should be respectfully and ethically treated. The bodies of those who died in 2019 were eventually repatriated and recovered, but during the 2019 season, a little noticed plea went out from the Nepalese government to help identify human remains of mountaineers recovered on the mountain. State-sponsored environmental cleanup teams had been on the mountain and had removed nearly 11 tons of garbage from the South Col route. And among that rubbish, the cleanup team had recovered unidentified human remains from previous Everest seasons, bodies that had been lost in falls, in serac collapses and avalanches, and bodies that had sometimes been informally disposed of by being pushed into crevasses. In Tibet, on the north of the mountain, the Chinese government pursues a form of territorial maximalism that extends state power over bodies all the way up to the international border. After 20 years on the North Ridge, Sewang Paljor's body disappeared in May 2014, almost certainly as the result of the actions of the Chinese Tibetan Mountaineering Association and their growing concern about the impact the bodies were having on press representations of mountaineering, visibly reducing the number of bodies currently on the Northeast Ridge. The bodies were not recovered and identified and returned to family members, but were presumably committed to the mountain, thrown down the Rongbuk or Kangshung faces to the glaciers below, or dumped in an area known as the Rainbow Valley, where a lot of bodies are pushed out of the way. And the Tibetan practice of self-immolation to protest the ongoing Chinese occupation has politicized bodies in Tibet, giving them dangerous symbolic properties in the context of occupied Tibet. And China has a very poor record of returning human remains to the families of victims of state violence, for instance. There is some indication that authorities on the north side of the mountain are now liaising more with adventure outfitting companies to determine what happens to human remains, but this hasn't been the case in the past. So I'd like to conclude. In his 2015 book, The Work of the Dead, The Cultural History of Mortal Remains, the historian Thomas Lacour states that no culture has been indifferent to the dead. And yet Everest seems to largely give the lie to this statement. It remains the focus of a multi-million-dollar adventure travel industry that sells the summit of Everest as the ultimate in prestige goods, with scarcely any mention of the corpses on the mountain. And what other tourist industry would take you to a place where you can at times sleep amongst visible accumulations of human remains? Where else but in a war zone would you encounter so many corpses? Theoretical concepts like dark tourism seem entirely insufficient to accommodate the physiological and moral landscape of the death zone, a darker form of tourism perhaps awaiting a name. Similarly, Christaver's theories of objection and the symbolic properties of human remains to delimit the border of the condition of living human beings seems curiously thrust aside by the powerful emotional, psychological, and affective regimes of adventure tourism on the mountain, where individualistic self-actualization and exaggerated expectations of agency fuel the drive for the summit. Above 8,000 meters, corpses enter new ontic states, new spatio-temporal regimes. The normal processes, both cultural and physical, of death, removal, disposal, leading eventually to incorporeality, are atelic or time-bounded. Here, at the extremes of altitude, the corpse persists in an atelic, unbounded state. Intentional disposal, either via biotic processes like burial or abiotic processes like cremation, are suspended. Natural abiotic processes, such as the mechanical forces of rockfall, freeze, thaw, temperature, light, moisture, wind, seem insufficient to break the body free from the icy prehension of the mountain. A form perhaps of disrupted sky burial, where disposal via excarnation is infinitely delayed, a sempiternal corporality that fuses corpse and mountain. Our normal schema for describing post-mortem processes is subverted. Efremov's concept of taphonomy, describing the transition of animal remains from the biosphere into the lithosphere, seems inverted. And normal biostratonomical processes, those that take place after death but before burial, become arrested. The corpse becomes fused to the lithosphere as part of the cryosphere, never undergoing the taphonomical stages of disarticulation, dispersal, accumulation, fossilization, and mechanical alteration. So following Van Gennep's schema concerning rites of passage around death, we could argue that the body is stuck in a liminal phase with none of the accompanying rites of separation, transformation, and incorporation. The philosopher Michael Marder, as I've said, has noted that the unworldliness of the mountain is what situates it on the hither side of mundane existence and of cold abstraction. That the summit symbolizes a state of exception where neither the political law nor the habitus of everyday life applies. It's perhaps ironic that the valorization of the summit position in Western culture has rendered the summit of Everest a mortuary landscape, each corpse a frozen rendering of the individuated self. The mountain slopes bringing to mind nothing so much as the corporeal version of a medieval purgatory, a place, in the words of the scholar Stephen Greenblatt, that enabled the dead not to be completely dead, not utterly gone, finished, complete, as those souls who resided in heaven or hell. But rather than a modern day place of intercession, on Everest we find both indifference to human remains and different approaches to the disposal of corpses, governed by the physical constraints placed on human agency and which side of the mountain you're on, and so on. It's as if here, above 8,000 meters, modern consumer capitalism and the hyper-individualistic values of modernity in our leisure cultures have gone quite literally to the ends of the earth to confirm the materialist prescriptions of the cynic philosopher Diogenes, the great spokesman for the dead body as fundamentally profane, unenchanted, a part of nature, mere carrion. So finally, Thomas Lecoeur noted that the willful, brutal disposal of the dead, the treatment of the corpse as carrion, is an act of extreme violence, an attack on the order and meaning we look to the dead to maintain for us. To make the obvious point, to treat a dead body as if it were organic, ordinary organic matter, to leave it to lie as if it was the body of a beast, or willfully to desecrate and mutilate it, is to erase it from culture and from the human community, to deny the existence of the community from which it came, to deny its humanity. Thank you.